Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. This episode is a part of our Kitchen Side series, where we pull back the curtain and show you the behind-the-scenes conversations, debates, strategies, and brainstorming sessions that we have at our agency. In this episode, we're talking about whether your blog is a publication or whether it is a library. This idea comes from a well-known and highly viral article written by Jimmy Daly a few years ago, in which he posits, with some exceptions, that blogs should be structured and written as libraries. That is, to serve deep informational intent and single-purpose usage, rather than a publication, which is broader content, thinner content, strung along sequentially in the aim of building an audience that comes back time after time. Since we here at Omniscient Digital run a content marketing agency, and especially since we pride ourselves on the strategic elements of content and SEO, this is obviously an important question that goes down to deep-rooted questions like, what should a blog be for? And how does your mental model of your blog affect the results that you expect to get and that you get from it? Anyway, I think this conversation was incredibly interesting. Without further ado, here is the Long Game Podcast.
So on this episode of Kitchen Side, we're talking content is a product. Is a blog a publication or a library? So first, do we want to distinguish between the two? I'd like to take this one.
Yeah, I don't actually know what it means. I thought that I did. I've said the term quite a few times, the publication versus library thing. And I think the original blog post, I think, made a lot of people think about that because there were some interesting ideas there. But I actually reread the post again from Animals, and I think there's too many ideas that are being wrapped up in the same concept. And did you guys read the article before this?
Yeah, I want to know which concepts you think we are referring to.
Yeah, so the definition here, I think it's something around breadth, right? The publication seeks to build an audience of repeat visitors. So that's one dimension. It's trying to build an audience by consistently and frequently, so more frequency, publishing topics of broad interest. So it's got this element of content strategy, which is like kind of which topics you choose to write about, and this seems to be broad. And then there was this idea, I think, in the article that also the publication was kind of like, it was shallow content. So I think the library was kind of writing, longer form, more in-depth stuff, which is catering towards the quality piece of it. And then later on in the article, it also mentioned that the library was focused on the distribution channel of SEO, whereas the publication was not so much. So I think there's like 6 or 7 different ideas in there that sometimes cluster, but don't always, So I'm not actually sure what, I think like if we could start with examples of what a publication and what a library is, I think that may help. But
the way I see it is like a publication is more like relevant right now and timely. A library is something that it can be built over time. And it kind of reminded me of Tommy Walker's theory, where he was like, having one blog linked to a whole bigger narrative as a whole. That's what I think of the library right now.
So I actually thought Tommy Walker's approach is more like the publication, which is sort of a sequential time-based thing that repeat visitors are supposed to come back and read in order. And the library was more so like any random person could come and get what they need that day, check out a book and go back and they've got their information, but it doesn't need to be the same person, and you don't need to read the sequel to the book. So I think maybe I am not fully understanding there, but I'm curious what y'all think about that.
I think you're correct, Alex, in that there are almost too many like dichotomies at play. You have reader behavior, you have timeliness and longevity, like trend versus evergreen. You have discovery channel, so SEO. There's just a lot of, I don't know, too many elements at play here to, I think, make a clean definition, in my opinion.
I wonder if a way to simplify it, and I'm just speaking off the cuff here, is a publication might be like, it's based on reader behavior. Like a publication is, each day I'm going to check this thing and expect some new content for me to think about. Like New York Times is clearly a publication. They might have a library of stuff that you can refer to, but for me personally, like I get a newsletter from them every day. That's a publication. Like I don't really care about what happened 2 weeks ago, such as the news cycle. But for a library, it's like, this is stuff I can reference no matter when it is. and it's just a library of thoughts or a catalog of ideas to go through, versus publication is more like every day or like habitually, and a public or a library is, I just need to go here when I need to reference something.
I also think that publications, like publication-based pieces, are more likely to be discovered outside of SEO because they are trend-based. So email, newsletter, social media, things where the topic itself probably catches someone's eye over the publication itself. They're just looking for that information. They don't necessarily they don't care like who's publishing it. It's just more like trend-based, timely. Whereas a library, like it's pretty likely that most SaaS companies' library of content is very similar. So in that sense, it almost like there's a trust element at play, or maybe it's like that library, which I know we discussed earlier, can double as like a knowledge base or something that the sales or the customer support teams can use. I'm sure we'll get into this later in the conversation, but a publication, like David said, is a lot more, it's timely, and it probably is something that people look for every day, something that isn't going to be evergreen.
So that's where I'm kind of confused still, is you mentioned that the library kind of invokes more trust, and like you kind of look to them as this source of truth and you go back to them, and that the publication, maybe you don't care as much who publishes it. But I feel like that is in opposition to the definition in the blog post, which is the publication is supposed to build repeat visitors, which you would expect would, be because of the trust and because of the brand or the writer. So I'm not totally sure where that dichotomy splits.
I know.
I think, David, you're right in terms of like the ephemeral, the timely versus the evergreen. But I only think that's one note of this. So maybe we could split it down and basically do it, each by each, where it's like, there's the SEO versus kind of social and buzzworthy distribution channels, that part of it. There's the long form, in-depth content around a single subject versus like the breadth. And then there's like the timeliness versus the kind of evergreen. And there's a couple different nodes there. And I also like the idea that we could talk about around like, should you build for repeat visitors versus new visitors? Mm-hmm. Because I think, and actually I wrote down this quote from the article. Okay, so we took a look at a few successful SaaS blogs and found that on those sites, only 17% of visitors were returning. Mm-hmm. That means 83% of visitors were new. You may have a negative reaction to this, but it's actually a good thing. But my question to that was, well, what if the 17% or whatever repeat visitors were the ones that were bringing in all the money? So just because like a large proportion of people are new, I don't think necessarily means you need to cater your strategy towards that in terms of what you write about. So I think there's a couple different dimensions that we could look at this.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to what exactly the company's goals are with content. Like, do you care about repeat visitors, or do you care more about like widening the target address or total addressable market and reaching more new people?
I wonder if publication, or excuse me, can't use that word. If like blogs or companies are using both levers, if publications, if their publication strategy is the lever that they pull to build repeat visitors through their library. Like, I didn't mean to say that folks don't care whose pieces they're reading when it comes to publications, but I think when it's a publication-based piece, it's trendy, it's timely, it's data-based, it's catching people's eye, it's top of mind. People are probably more likely to click on that if it's like a really interesting title or interesting, like, I don't know, thesis. And then maybe they start to build trust through those timely pieces. And then they start to read like the more evergreen. I don't necessarily agree with Jimmy's narrowly focused topics definition of the library. I actually think libraries are probably broader in that sense. But I'm only thinking about SaaS companies here. I know this probably varies depending on industry. But I also think there's a dichotomy here between establishing demand and meeting demand. I think when it comes to the publication side of things, you're probably creating demand. You're sharing maybe original research. You're sharing a new opinion on a trending topic. Maybe that's where you, depending on your distribution channel, attract new visitors. And then when it comes to building repeat visitors, that's when you send them over to your library where you have more evergreen. Maybe it's a little bit more middle of funnel. The thing about the library that's interesting to me is that's where I see a lot of like, this is another type of element, the content optimization, content maintenance, updating and refreshing content that needs to be on your site regardless. It's not going to fundamentally change, but it's almost just keeping those plates spinning, keeping that content alive. That's where I feel like the library comes into play. It's a little bit more static. I'm not sure. There's a lot of things at play here.
Content is vertically integrated, meaning that each topic is addressed from the top of the funnel to the bottom.
So that's going to be like, what is customer satisfaction, how to do customer satisfaction surveys, and then best customer satisfaction tools. That's what that means, is they're all going to be vertically integrated through the funnel, but they're all going to be on the same topic. I think that's the piece that I agree on. It's like, you should just write about the topic, to the full extent. Like that's basically the pillar and cluster model though.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and most companies, provided they're up and up on their content strategy, they're going to have a library of evergreen content as it pertains to their audience and their tool or their product. That's pretty fundamental. And then in order to stay active, stay top of mind, to be like thought leaders and all this stuff, they're probably going to release a type of publication content, or maybe they're doing fresh research on, customer service or whatever your example was. And that kind of layers on top of that library of content. And that's how they stay. That's what their content marketing team then does actively to stay like fresh and top of mind. I think that you can do both.
That's what I was going to say, is I think you should do both, because one thing that I'm coming up against, I've got this mental model in my head right now that HubSpot is a library and Intercom is a publication. I don't know if y'all agree with that, but I need something concrete. Otherwise I'm just, speaking abstractly about ideas that aren't mine. So in this HubSpot example, they do the pillar and cluster. Everything's organized. Actually, one idea that I really liked from the piece was that we shouldn't order our blog chronologically. It should actually be in these like kind of topic-based clusters and like by best of. And by the way, people actually want to like go consume that. I think that's an interesting idea. But let's go with HubSpot. They're going to attack this customer satisfaction angle from all sides. Well, they've got a built-up website and domain authority that allows them to rank for all that stuff pretty easily. And SEO makes sense as a distribution channel. But if you're trying to replicate that as a newer SaaS company going up against essentially all these red oceans, like there's not a lot of like just clean green landscapes anymore in terms of SaaS blogs, you're going to have to do something to stand out. You can't just write 2,000 words plus 200, and do a skyscraper and all these pieces and expect that strategy to work out. I think you still need some of this. I don't know if it's timely content, original research, something to stand out, something to build an audience. Otherwise, I just think it's never going to land on that first page of Google, and you're probably not going to see the tip of the iceberg crack through the surface in the first place.
Yeah.
I think no company is going to set themselves apart through just a library of evergreen content. I think that it can serve a purpose. It can definitely attract traffic from Google if things are obviously optimized. I think it can serve, like I said earlier, as a asset for sales, customer support, just, if you need help with the product or the company. But I don't think you're ever going to set yourself apart with just why is this important, X amount of tools to do this. And that's when I think of a library, that's what I think of. And that has its value. I think that's why content optimization and updates and refreshes are becoming so prominent, because people have all this awesome content that needs to stay up to date. But that alone, as I think a marketing lever, acquisition lever, whatever, it's never really going to set yourself apart because so many people are doing it. And I think that's where you have to layer on the publication efforts. Like Alex said, original research, whatever. This reminds me of a company called BetterUp. I'm pretty close friends with their head of content. They have both active. She shared with me that their goal is to obviously become a publication that folks turn to for mental health in the workplace, but they have layered on this SEO effort of the, I don't want to call it basic content because it's not basic, but just like I said, it's the definition pieces, it's the how-to pieces, the listicles, the roundups. There's a time and place for that. And she wanted to kind of build that foundation, but that's not where they're putting their effort in the long run. They have a gazillion pieces of original data. They're establishing that demand in the space, building their self as a thought leadership. And the way that they're doing that is publishing timely, interesting data-based pieces. Now, over time, that stuff's going to phase out. You can't really update that over time unless you run new reports, things like that. But it's all interconnected, and I think both serve a very distinct purpose. I just don't know if I agree 100% with these definitions and like no, how they come
definitions need work. Because one other thing that I wanted to say is, and this is just maybe breaking down the point of the piece in the first place. This is published in 2017 or 2018 or something, so maybe it was a different time. But the piece was framed in a way that made it sound like everybody's doing a publication and that's wrong and that they should be doing the library. Yeah. I had trouble thinking about any SaaS blogs that do the publication. I think most of them do the library.
Do them well.
But on the top of your head, can you think, I mean, outside of like maybe Intercom and
I feel like HubSpot has attempted to do that. I think that stuff gets absolutely buried under other types of efforts. I think it almost comes down to like the element of how you're distributing, how it's playing a larger role with your library efforts. And I don't know, maybe it comes down to how you freaking design your blog. Like maybe you need two different things. Maybe you need like a publication and a blog. I don't know. That's getting into like UX stuff, but HubSpot tries. They might be better at it now. When I was there, it definitely got buried in like the clusters.
I wonder if he feels the same way about this today. Like if we were to ask him, like,
yeah, we should talk to him about that.
Well, I was thinking the same thing. I had on Ryan on the podcast a couple months ago, and I think he mentioned that Jimmy wrote a new piece questioning the initial advice. So I don't even think, I'm not sure if the advice even still stands today, but whatever, we're going to debate that original topic because I think it did become very popular. I have another pithy thing I was thinking about, maybe a clever thing, but even if you like take this analogy of the library, like, you go in, I need a book, I don't know, on how to cook Indian food or something like that. And I go in and I've got my specific purpose and I find the perfect book for it. It's, it did its job. But the library's goal isn't that I never come back. It's not that I just check out that one book. It's that I go get a library card, they collect my information, mark it to me, and I come back frequently. So in that sense, your job in a library is still to...
That's true.
It's still to build an audience. It's still to have repeat visitors.
That's why I think visitor behavior, you don't need to dive into that here. Like obviously both have the goal of driving repeat visitors.
Yeah, I wonder if the context around this blog post was maybe back in 2017 or 2018 when it was written. Lots of websites or blogs were just publishing content on a particular cadence just for sake of getting content out there. Like there was supposed to be a publication. I do remember there was sort of a trend like that. And now we've moved towards a place where everyone tried to do that. It's like, great, now we have all this content. It's not doing anything for us. And now it's more of probably where we're landing is probably a mix of, you want to publish frequent thoughts and share your ideas, but not just for the sake of publishing content. Like you should have this core library of content that's maybe for the goal of demand gen, like the funnel based content. And then you have this other content that's more thought leadership, that's more timely and based on whatever the talking points are in that period. And it's like a portfolio of content and you have to decide like, hey, how much time are we going to spend on each of these things? Do we realistically have that much original research or original data, or original thoughts to like publish 4 of these articles a month versus, hey, we need to build out this library.
Yeah.
I think the biggest separator is, I guess, distribution channel or how you intend it to be found, that content to be found. And this might be too simplistic. I'm sure we can dive into this a little bit more, but the library, I think that's where SEO definitely excels. I think that's where a lot of ideas for library-based pieces come, keyword research, competitor analysis, building that content foundation. But publication pieces, I actually think SEO and keywords would probably ruin the whole point of it. I think that stuff is a little bit more fluid, which is maybe why people struggle with it because they don't know what to write about. Like David said, maybe they don't have enough research. Maybe they've tried to do a thought leadership project with their executive team and it didn't work out. But that's where I feel like the biggest separator, in my opinion, is how you intend these things to be discovered and where you kind of come up with the topics.
Yeah, I think, David, your point on the context of this piece is probably accurate, because I do, now that I'm thinking back, remember a lot of clients in the past saying like, oh, we need to publish twice a week or something like that. People will forget about us if they don't. Like, it's like they thought they had an audience of people waiting with bated breath for their next blog post, which is almost never the case. So, and analogously, maybe it's like, right, you have Netflix that just has this library of content always available on demand. And that seems to be the model that people consume content with for the most part. And then there's like Game of Thrones, which dropped every week, and it was on this drip because people truly were waiting with bated breath for that next episode. So it's a consumption modality for sure. I think like if you're doing SEO and you have 100 blog posts ready to publish, there's no fucking point waiting to publish them. Just publish them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why would you wait? They're just going to be distributed via organic search anyway. And then, even if it's not SEO driven, like even if it's thought leadership, even if it's buzzworthy stuff, I think you could publish it, and then it's your distribution channels that you use as like the audience lever, right? So to your point, Ali, it's like dripping those things through an email newsletter or something like that. Social media, like how you display and distribute those on social media could differ. But I think in terms of the publishing cadence, I think it's absolutely correct to say you don't need to act like you're running, a Game of Thrones type show. That's not how people are actually viewing your content. They're not going to forget about you if you wait 2 weeks to really publish something amazing, or if you publish 6 things this week, they're not going to be overloaded with it, right? I think that's a valid point.
This reminds me of when I used to have a Zanga and I would write like every day, and when I stopped publishing posts for a couple of days, I'd be like, on my next post, I'd be like, sorry, like update everyone on the last 3 days, as if people were waiting to hear about my day.
David, you had a publication.
Definitely a publication, not a library.
Do you think it is like that with podcasts, though? Like, do you think? I mean, it feels more like a publication than a library.
Feel like a publication. Yeah, like
newsletters.
The All-In podcast. The All-In podcast. They didn't release an episode for like 2 weeks, and I was like refreshing Spotify because I thought like that there was a bug or something. I was like, where's the next episode?
Yeah,
I'm the same way with people that I follow rapidly. Like I actually do notice when they don't publish. That is kind of interesting.
And I get upset.
So is it fair to say that a blog as a content medium is just always going to be a library? And what you do with that content is what makes it a publication?
Yeah.
I think almost always, because the blog itself, you're not going to have the embedded distribution channels. Even in the case of like somebody like Tim Urban and Wait But Why, I don't know how many people actually get notifications when he publishes something. I think they do when he emails them. So it's like the blog itself still acts as a library. I'm sure if you went to the homepage, he would have some of his most popular posts there for new people who are just discovering it. But then for me, like somebody who actually follows the blog, I subscribe to the email newsletter, and that's where I am an audience member. That's where it acts like a publication. But yeah, maybe it's like the medium itself. Like the blog doesn't seem conducive to a drip sequence, to a waiting with bated breath type thing. It seems like something that people just go to when they need something. Maybe they just want to read top content, etc. And then maybe you just treat other channels accordingly to like how people actually consume those channels. Newsletters, Ali, you made a great point there. Newsletters are something where, I mean, I can't even feasibly think of how it would be a library. It's just by nature a publication, right?
No, I think Substack can make your newsletter into a library if people want to go back and read old like editions. But the nature of a newsletter is to alert of a new piece and keep things timely. Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I mean, is it still a valid goal to build that newsletter or to build that audience on, your podcast or social media? Like, even if you take the full-on strategy of a library, let's say we're just doing a full-on SEO distribution play. We're doing pillar and cluster long-form pieces. And with that, we don't really expect, return visitors. Is it still our goal to like collect those email addresses and build that audience to make it possible to have a newsletter that is kind of a publication?
I mean,
in my opinion, yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and I would dig into why we would want to call it a newsletter, like to make it a publication, because
or email
I'm gonna think about this in terms of like a SaaS business. Like you have a library of content where you want to have evergreen content and capture people through SEO, doing searches for those queries related to your product or business, and you educate them. They want to learn more from you because they want to get better at in their industry or whatever. They give you their email, but it's not just to give them content. It's also like to nurture them to eventually buy your product or get your service. And then sure, you might have some of the thought leadership stuff that is a part of the content portfolio that you kind of treat as like, hey, there's no distribution channel besides these people we know that are interested in our content. Now we can share these more unique ideas that don't have an SEO or distribution built into it. I want to open it up too, like the library concept doesn't just apply to prospects or potential customers or existing customers. It's also for like the sales team. Like how are you enabling them with the library of content on your blog so that when they're on sales calls, they can show that, hey, this is stuff we actually educate our customers on. So that becomes another.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
There's a point I see that Jimmy had said, like content is built for people who need it when they need it. I definitely think like the way that Google is designed is to just give people, exactly what they need and that's it. I think collecting emails is when it switches from like someone saying, oh, I found my answer to I found my answer, but I'm curious about what else you have to say. And then I think that's a huge like trust indicator, or like I'm interested in building trust with you, or I like the way you teach me things. I want to learn more from you, especially if it's a library. Like HubSpot's library of information is nothing new. Like I was one of the writers on that team. I pulled stuff from other blogs. Like it's literally just a way to drive traffic. But the fact that they collect emails even from their most top of funnel pieces, that is how they transition from a library to, I don't want to say to a publication, but to getting that interest from readers. And it becomes less about the information, more about like who's giving that information and what the brand is, and eventually the product and all that stuff, hopefully. But I think that's why, like, even though a library might not be timely and maybe it doesn't turn into a newsletter publication or a time-based publication, I think it's still an important lever, the email list.
I don't know if this is a related idea or not, but I think it kind of is, because you mentioned something about how HubSpot, the content they're putting out is nothing new, which is totally true of most blogs. So it's not just ripping on HubSpot, but essentially you have a writer who's doing research on a topic. Maybe. You're looking across Google. You're usually taking from the first top 10 or 20 posts, repurposing it slightly and adding your little touch, your little introduction. And it's essentially the same piece of content. So my question there is, like, when everybody's doing it, it seems to me that it's a red ocean and it's really difficult to compete in. So my inclination in all those situations is to zag when other people are zigging. So now, and I maybe should have read this, but Ryan mentioned that Jimmy wrote something in his newsletter that was basically walking back and saying, maybe now publications are a thing. And I think we see this trend now with HubSpot buying The Hustle and like other companies. I think Stripe and Coinbase and, a bunch of these companies are getting into publications and trying to build essentially media arms. It seems like now would be the time to question that advice of the library and say, like, maybe now is the time to stand out in a different way. And just because it's so commonplace, it's so hard to compete in these landscapes now. Any validity to that idea?
Questioning Jimmy's original statement or his correction?
His original statement. Like, if you're a new SaaS company, should you build a library or should you seek to stand out and just build a once daily newsletter or something like that?
I think you should build a library. I think you should have low expectations. And I think you should partner with other teams at your company to understand how can this serve more of a purpose than just organic traffic? Because then you don't have to have these singular traffic goals. Because depending on how new your company is, depending on your domain rating, depending on how many resources you have, like, you might not be able to even make anything of your library for quite a long time. But if you can work with the rest of your team, understand what your sales team needs, you could kill multiple birds with one stone and then maybe get the perks of the organic traffic down the line. So yeah, I would say a library is still a great investment. But I would avoid just coming at it from like, what are just what our competitors are doing, just what are the top 3 things we need to define and create listicles for. I mean, those things are valuable too, but I think if you can kind of start a little bit broader, maybe check more boxes with it, it could serve more of a purpose sooner while still, satisfying that organic traffic goal that you might have down the line.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was perfect.
Okay.
I do think that it's hard to at least prove ROI if you don't hit some of those bottom funnel search keywords. I think it's difficult to predict. the consistency of ROI with something like a newsletter or something like a publication-based blog. So in the end, if you really truly are invested in content, it probably helps to build some of those assets out and eventually gain the attention and eventually rank those.
Well, the good thing is like once you have your library, you have it. Like it's just a matter of content optimization, some refreshes, but building that foundation is most of the work. And then over time, it's just a matter of maintenance and putting in some time down the line to make sure everything's up and running. But the publication, if you invest in it, the media arm, whatever you want to call it, that definitely requires a lot more work over time, a little bit more consistency.
Carissa, did you have a question about which businesses this is right for, like what the fit is?
No, but we can definitely talk about that. You guys answered a lot of the questions I had.
Well, I think that question is pretty interesting because I think our agency went through this process where initially we were going to try to build a library and now we're trying to build a publication. True?
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's true.
Why did we go through that thought process?
I think we evaluated that a library in the sense of like pursuing organic traffic from that wasn't a good fit for us because our company is still a baby, doesn't have a huge presence in terms of domain ratings, so it's not very competitive on the SERPs. And B, our audience doesn't need content marketing to be defined. So many of the opportunities that we were identifying, which were at first valid, right? Good volume, interesting, our competitors were doing it, etc. But then you really thought about like, how does this work in practice? Like someone isn't going to Google content marketing and then bam, invest in an agency. There might be a time and place for that down the line, maybe not that exact query, but it seemed like it was a better use of our resources to lead with our expertise, which in turn ended up being a little bit more timely and trend-based content.
Yeah, that question makes me realize we actually didn't explicitly discuss like the reasons. It was more of, yeah, this makes sense. And I think as I think about it now, it's sort of like, what would a library look like? And my framework of thinking was, well, it probably covered things like what content marketing is, why they need to do it, strategies for content marketing, and like basic things like that people want to know, which are what other marketing agencies do, what HubSpot does, what other marketing software companies do. And a realization hit that like, wait, we don't want to compete on this stuff. And we also don't want the people searching these terms because like they're way top of funnel. We don't want to educate people on what content marketing is. We want to reach the people who know content marketing is important, are trying to figure out the best way to do it, and are looking for people who are smart and have a unique way to approach it and are really good at what they do. So it turned into, well, we have some strong opinions on how this is done well. We've done it before, and we should talk about that versus like the super basic stuff.
I guess to be fair, our new direction isn't necessarily a publication in the sense that it's completely like timely and trendy, because even right now we're creating a piece of content that is evergreen. It's not based on like anything going on at this moment, but it's not rooted in like succinct keywords. That might be another difference between publication and library.
How we distribute it is. So that's the whole thing. It's like we're pushing this out on like YouTube, on our podcast, and on our social. And I think the way we're positioning the content is more like a publication. Even if it's not, we're not talking about news. I know that, but I think the way that we distribute it more resembles a publication than library.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the difference between publication and library comes into play in how you formulate the idea, how you execute, and then how you distribute. And I think like all three categories, we are matching the publication side of things. It's just for some reason I'm still stuck on this like time thing. And like, so in this specific situation, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter timely versus evergreen, but you're right in that we're still following kind of the publication practices.
So how would you take this and make it more of a library approach then? Like or does that even make sense?
I mean, I guess it will become a library of content, but in the way that people typically discover libraries, which is Google and all that stuff, I don't know if this will completely check that box, because I kind of had pushed keywords out of my mind as we've come up with these topics, which has been not the most comfortable thing, but it's because like that is not where we're playing right now. And that's okay. So like Alex said, we're using other distribution channels and not SEO. And maybe one day this will rank. I don't know what for, but.
Well, I think I can answer that maybe with some of the stuff that Jimmy talked about in the article, which is a flat site architecture. So not based on chronological order. Like we could order these in terms of topics, right? We have a bunch of podcasts about content strategy, about content promotion. We have several that we've just done on like mental health and just general like personal growth, right? So we could organize it in topics based on UX research about people want what they want to read. That would be like the on-site stuff. And then there's the idea of just basically appending a keyword to the topic that we talk about on these podcasts. So there's ways that we could turn this into, I guess, a library. This is where the metaphor breaks down for me, though, is because there's so many different dimensions that we're judging this on. It's like the content strategy that we're doing is not a library strategy, but the distribution, I mean, we could append some SEO keywords here and we could get some of the same benefit. And that's where I think the analogy is a little bit difficult to comprehend because of those multiple nodes. And there's also the idea that we're doing this on like deep topics. We're pretty much all doing these on content. So that's a library, it's not like a broad focus. And most of what we do is pretty in depth. Like all of our podcasts are super long form. Even these are like 45 minutes to an hour. So it's not like we're just brushing by and doing like these very shallow topics. So I think we have a mix of it. And again, that's why I think I have trouble with the initial analogy.
Yeah, I think we can agree it's a false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's just more to it.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to kind of echo on, David, your point earlier about like why we stopped doing the library approach and started doing the publication. It's competitive. It's something that I think a lot of the SEO driven stuff, if you're only doing SEO driven keywords, like you're going to find that the volume caters towards very, very beginner level people. And that's something that we had to face at CXL is like, we didn't want to write what is A/B testing. We didn't want to write what is conversion rate optimization. And we didn't want to write about Google Analytics bounce rate. We wanted the people who were experts already. And that's a fundamental trade-off because there's going to be much less search volume for those terms. That was a trade-off we made. And we focused on building an audience through our email list, which I guess now that I think about it, CXL was kind of a publication. Mm-hmm. The third thing that I don't think you hit on is that we are selling expertise. We are agency founders who are selling content marketing. And to showcase that, we have to showcase that through content. And if we wrote what is SEO and what is content marketing, we're not necessarily doing the best job at showcasing our expertise, nor are we addressing the right people. And I think actually Jimmy wrote about that in his newsletter. So maybe this is what Ryan was referring to, but I got the quote here. It says, I've often said that SaaS companies should treat their blogs like libraries, not publications. The opposite is true for consultants and agencies. Since SEO is unlikely to drive lots of business your way, you have to win on ideas and to share those ideas on social media and email. This means that you can actually build an audience and that the content you publish should be smart, analytical, thoughtful, thought-provoking, etc., as opposed to being engineered to game an algorithm. Now, I think that's super true of agencies. I mean, we're seeing the benefits. People listen to the podcast, people reference it in sales calls, but I don't think it's untrue for other companies. I don't think that necessarily excludes SaaS companies or e-commerce companies or anything else.
We're going through this with some clients too. They're like, we know what the competition's writing to rank for SEO and like the same keywords we want to go after. We want to share like our unique perspective that we know our competitors don't have. So we want to like adjust our strategy to do that. And I think that's going to become more and more true because there's so much competition in a SaaS space. Like there's so many customer support software. There's so many marketing automation software companies. Like you got to differentiate somehow. And like trying to target the same keyword with very similar content is not going to differentiate you.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to like what you said earlier in the call, David, about like business goals. Like if the company wants to compete on expertise, even if they're selling like a intangible product, I mean, that's definitely something that can and should be done. It just depends on if that's something that your customers can resonate with. If it's something that you've seen like on sales calls and on customer feedback calls, like that's something that wants to be seen, then it's worth investment in, just as agencies do.
It's funny how all of this always comes back to the foundational stuff. It's like, how do you win? And basically like doing a SWOT analysis or some sort of exercise like that. Because when we go through with clients, when we go through with ourselves, it's like, you have an influential contrarian founder. That's a strength. We should lean on that. Oh, you have a low domain rating. library might not work. Like there's multiple different dimensions that you can score these things on. And without doing that exercise, I think it's really difficult to say like a blanket statement such as all SaaS companies should be libraries. Because I think, if you're a 10 domain rating in a space like CRM and you have a super influential contrarian founder who's founded 3 other companies before, I probably wouldn't do the library play.
Well, that's what Jarvis does. Like Jarvis is kind of new, but they led a lot with expertise, and I don't know if it aligned perfectly with a publication as we've been talking about it, but they led with expertise for a long time before investing in a library. And they've done very well. So I think if it like a SaaS company, if they want to go with the publication approach, it's not as clean cut as like a library approach. It takes a lot of like trial and error, a lot of effort, a lot of conversations. I know we have been talking about how to help people do that. And it's definitely a different process than a library approach.
I think that.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I was going to say there's pros and cons in like different company stages where these things make sense. It's like the publication to me sounds like higher variance. So there's going to be some big wins and some like total losses. And I think the cool thing about the publication thing is you can learn a lot faster. You're going to get pretty rapid feedback on whether something's working or not. Whereas like the library play, the long form content, the focus on SEO distribution, it's always going to be a long game unless you're already doing it and you were doing it 10 years ago, like HubSpot. It's almost always going to take a long ass time to like get that feedback loop. So you've kind of got to believe in it deeply. And it's also I think it's more expensive too. I think it's going to be much more expensive to do that play. So it's one of those things where you have to strategically say, I know we can win here and here's how. And I know it's going to take a long time, but I've got faith. And like, this is going to be like the time horizon we try this in. So I think, there's different stages of companies where that would work. And, if you're running out of money and you need to raise that next round, like maybe the library play is not going to work in 6 months. So maybe you got to try something different. I think it just depends so much.
Yeah. I found this recent article, 2019, where Jimmy Daly, they asked for a counterexample to that rule. And he says, Intercom publishes content multiple times a week, and it's always by subject matter experts. They succeed as a publication because they have the budget and manpower and a long runway. So their content team is internally made up of 10 or 12 people. But basically it's because of subject matter experts, I guess.
Yeah, but the long runway and big budget also is a thing with libraries, probably more so, I would say. I don't know if I wouldn't wedge it on that trade-off. I do think Intercom has unique advantages in that they have a lot of product people and salespeople and customer success people willing to like, take the microphone and actually like write the blog post and work with the writers who are doing that. You don't get that at every company. If you're at a startup, I think engineer is probably best suited to actually engineering. If you're Intercom, I think they started doing this pretty late, Series B, Series C, Series D. I don't think they started out with this. But so another thing about Intercom is they were competing in a very competitive space, right? Like they had HubSpot and all these big MarTech companies. So I think they're basically dealing with the problem we were talking about earlier, which is, tons of high-powered websites writing about the same stuff. So I don't think they could have probably won if they played that same game. I don't think it's more expensive. I don't think it's necessarily more expensive to do it that way.
So I'm looking at Winter's blog. I very much think Pep is not taking the library approach. Like he's doing the Winter Games. He's treating it like kind of a publication and he sends out the newsletter, which is interesting because Pep is a very opinionated dude. And I think people like that and they respect his opinion. And that's why they want to work with him.
It's respect.
Pep is Winter is the perfect example of this because if we did a SWOT analysis for that, Winter would be a new company in a space that nobody has names for. There is user testing and UX software and copywriting software and messaging. So like maybe there's some search volume for those terms, but really he's creating a new category. So that's where I think Animals actually put out another blog post. I think Jimmy wrote like a movement first content thing. They talked about Drift, making up the term conversational marketing and leading with thought leadership. Even HubSpot in the early days doing inbound marketing. So he's doing that. And then if we did a SWOT analysis for him, it would be, Pep's a strong voice with a big following and people want to hear his opinions. So I think all of those factors converge to the idea that he should be doing a publication, not necessarily a library. Now, maybe as time goes on, they start to write those SEO focused pieces and start to build out that base for the long term. But yeah, I think, Dave, that's actually a really great example of a SaaS company doing something different.
What would the and this is more devil's advocate, like why down the line would he invest in a library of those kind of basic keywords?
Well, I think eventually he's going to want to expand his audience. I think he's going to want to attract like the general audience of product marketers, copywriters. I don't know his exact target audience. I think those are probably the main ones. And I think you're just going to find a wider audience with search. And I think like, as you start to expand and as you start to like figure out your numbers and increase your run rate, you're going to have more time and patience for those more beginner level people to pay off. And it's going to become more of an awareness play. Yeah. And I also think they're probably building we talk a lot about this kind of dichotomy between, create demand and capture demand. And I think he's got to create a lot of demand. And through that process, he's going to get these conversations started. So eventually people will be searching for some of these things. Mm-hmm. So I think he's just creating the demand first, and then later you can kind of harvest it.
Right.
I don't know for sure if that's what Pep's doing. I haven't talked to him about that, but I would guess that would be, somewhat of the strategy.
Yeah. I was curious because that was kind of what I talked with Jamie at Better Up. When she mentioned that they had been doing this publication approach for a while and they were going back and building like the SEO, building up their SEO channel, I was like, why? She said the same thing. They've established a lot of demand, a lot of phrases, a lot of conversation around things that didn't have search volume before. And they were ready to widen their like audience scope, bring in a more of a variety of people. So I was interested to see what you would say about Winter. Because right now when I go to their blog, like it's all stuff from Winter Games, like all very heavily opinionated. Like you need to know what you're talking about if you want to read their blog. There's not a lot of like definition stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a sort of a maturity model or like a timeline of company maturity where there's a sliding scale of your content portfolio. And this gets back to the barbell strategy of new entrant in a saturated space or creating a new space. You need to have strongly held opinions that will start influencing the conversations in the industry and get people to pay attention to your product versus the existing incumbents. And then over time, as you build that thought leadership amongst the people who are already thinking about the problems that you solve, over time, that pool of people is going to get smaller and smaller because you're reaching most of them. You need to start opening up your audience to people who are sort of interested or not as educated on the topic yet. So your portfolio slowly goes from that opinionated thought leadership to more of the evergreen foundational content, building out that library to reach the newbies, let's call them that. Yeah. And like, that's when it's like, one, all your strong thought leadership built your business because now you have customers to fund building out the longer term assets.
Yeah,
I think we should write a blog post on that.
You target like the top 25%. I don't want to say top, but like the most experienced 25. Yeah. Or they already are super familiar with the space and they don't need the definitions and they don't need the what is, why is this important pieces. Like they're ready to either engage or buy or become a fan, audience member. And then, like you said, you widen the scope, and maybe at that point you're ready to widen the products that you sell or the things that you offer to then expand and bring folks into the funnel sooner. That's really interesting. I feel like that's probably the best way to compete, especially if it's something that's like super, super saturated.
Because you're not going to win on the SEO, like foundational SEO strategy targeting high volume keywords.
Well, think about stealing customers or snagging customers. Like you're only going to do that with a super strong opinion, and like that can be a differentiator way better than a new product.
I think our barbell strategy answers this pretty well, because we did talk about the sliding scale, and I think one of the foundational pieces that we look at when we build content strategy is what scale they're at and what industry they're in. Who's competing with them. So it's like, if you're very early stage in a very competitive space, we can't really make content work at scale or SEO driven content work at scale. So we're going to over index on buzzworthy stuff in the beginning days. Now, if you're an early company in like a space like cannabis, I worked with a client in the cannabis space. Nobody's doing content. So we just started out and had like a 10 domain rating and we're crushing it on keywords. So it's like there's those two dimensions. And I don't know if we talked much about the industry thing in our barbell strategy blog post, but I know we had that idea around the sliding scale. As your company, becomes more and more likely to rank for these terms, you can kind of ease up. Oh, and the content economics piece too. That was a big point in that, is that your goal should actually to be to lower the marginal cost of content over time, to increase the marginal utility, because over time you're gonna be able to produce less and less expensive content. You're going to be able to write more of these SEO driven pieces that mimic other people's stuff and rank for it, therefore lowering the cost while simultaneously increasing the ROI because it's going to rank faster. And that was a total conversation about scale and company stage. We should put that together in some sort of framework though, because I think that would help a lot of people.
Yeah, really interesting. Cool. So to sum up, is a blog a publication or a library? Would you say that it really, like, I think I gathered that it just depends and it should be a combination of both. Like, that was a bold statement of Jimmy to make.
Oh yeah,
I would say
but that's
I think
why
it doesn't
people talk
matter
about it.
I would say the blog as a medium is just by default a library. I think where the dichotomy comes in is like how you distribute your content. Well, it comes in on how you ideate, execute, and distribute, like I said. So there's three different differentiating factors there. But like we said earlier, just by nature, I think a blog is just a library. It's just how you use that content.
Makes sense.
Does that answer your question?
I think it doesn't matter. I think you should ask two questions, which is how is this content going to make me money? How is it going to return positive ROI? And how am I going to win at this strategy? Me specifically, how is my company going to win? I don't think it matters what you call it.
Allie.
No, I agree. I just think like when it comes to the simple question, I think if people expect to put out timely pieces on a blog and do nothing else, that's not a publication. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more of the activity. Like Alex said, it's like, why are you doing it? What do you expect from it? And then what are you going to do with it? But like, yeah, the blog doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So
cool. Really good talk.
I think if a blog post that you want to write can be written by AI, like Jarvis, then it's probably a library. Versus if it's something very strongly opinionated that cannot be replicated by a software like that, you're probably trying to go for a publication.
Wait till the technology gets better though.
Yeah,
we'll someday.
Someday those robots will be defining.
Someday they'll be doing these conversations in our place.
Yeah.
Oh, and I can't wait. It's
I am
great.
a robot, actually.
I hope to be old and dead by the time that happens.
Yeah. Can you imagine this in a couple of years? That stuff no longer applies.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Maybe one day robots will be debating whether a blog is a library or a publication.
With a little robot misfit dog coming in.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That would be funny.
I love it.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. Really good.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, this was fun.